everyone to episode 13 of the Hard Truth About B2B e-commerce. I'm your co-host Isaiah Bollinger, and I'm here with Tim. Tim, take it away.
Hi, I'm Timothy Peterson, having a great time. Welcome to the Hard Truth About B2B e-commerce. Our sponsor, Punch Out To Go, is a global B2B integration company specializing in connecting commerce business platforms with e-procurement and ERP applications. So Punch Out To Go's iPaaS tech seamlessly links business applications to automate the flow of purchasing data. Thank you to our sponsor, and I'm going to send it right back to Isaiah to continue.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Brady and the team at Punch Out To Go. So very excited to introduce our guest, Mark Sutherland, who I had the pleasure of meeting on Zoom earlier this year via introduction, just because we're both kind of in the B2B space, B2B e-commerce space, and he's been in B2B e-commerce for most of his career. And Mark, you've been in kind of the trenches on the customer side, and now you recently switched over to the agency side, maybe the dark side, if you will.
I've moved to the dark side.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of that evolution and how you came into B2B e-commerce.
Sure. So I actually had a different career. I'd worked in face-to-face sales and project management in the construction business for 10 years. And then the recession hit in 2008. So I finally got a project management qualification. After all those years of putting buildings up, some things, I finally got a qualification. And I found myself in a small company that was doing e-banking, building websites with a development team out of India and clients here in the UK, putting websites together and testing, go through that process, and very quickly morphed into a company in Sheffield called Insight, who I very quickly discovered were actually a global value-added reseller of IT equipment, headquartered out of Phoenix, Arizona. But over here in Europe, their operational center for a lot of their web development and e-commerce was in Sheffield in the UK. And they picked Sheffield because, for a number of reasons, it has 2 universities, so lots of graduates who speak lots of different languages. It was relatively easy to find developers. It's a city that people like to stay in. And I joined as an e-procurement consultant initially. So I was essentially out on the road talking to clients, linking them through platforms like Ariba and Cooper, but also European specific ones like PCOS, which is the Scottish government system, and linking them into to drive commerce online. Shortly afterwards, I was promoted to run their sales and trading operations across 14 countries for their e-commerce, and we ended up with about 10,000 B2B clients.
Wow.
Here in Europe. Multiple.
Wow is right. Wow.
And at the time I started, we were trading about 110 million euros. We ended up with about 190 million after 3 years.
Wow.
So big growth, a lot of it through connecting big clients and people like Thomson Reuters. And I'm hoping that this many years after I've left them, I'm allowed to say all these names. But also lots of government clients, Siemens, people like that, who were sending through huge volumes of orders, relatively low value, but lots of volume. And that was a real experience in the sort of trading and customer side, linking very closely with how their sales teams worked, so that we could drive the administration and the order processing out of sales teams and free them up with time. And that's become a real focus for me. Subsequently, I built a B2B e-commerce site for a construction materials company, which was operating across 6 countries in Europe. I had a little bit of segue into B2C for one of the UK's banks, National Savings and Investment, and then ended up being headhunted by Rico to run their e-commerce proposition across Europe. So they built a website, and they've done the classic thing of getting an IT team and a marketing team and no e-commerce people whatsoever. Um, and
How did that go?
well, 2 years later, they hired me. So
There you
um,
go.
essentially, one of the challenges was the user experience didn't really meet the client's needs. And so if you think about the variety of people ordering office print product, ordering IT and associated hardware, you've got a lot of product in a site, 70,000 odd SKUs on an individual country site. You've got personalized pricing, all the challenges I'm sure you've discussed with lots of your guests before. And you're having to surface that data up quickly, accurately, so users can find what they need. And that's, I suppose, it's easy to say that that sounds easy, but it isn't. And then you throw in the challenges of translation and languages and currency and all these fun things. I left Rico in April, and I've set up a business with a couple of colleagues who've been through similar sorts of routes. And we're really focused on the challenges that businesses face when they're doing this. So how do I change from an organization that sells predominantly over the phone or face-to-face to be one that at least my day-to-day run rate business, so the business that's relatively low value but can be quite profitable, is driven online. I free my sales teams up. So that's what we spend our time at Transform to Digital doing.
Well, this is exciting stuff, Mark. I'm going to dive in and ask you one of the first things that's on our minds, and I think our listeners are going to be really interested in this. How do you demystify digital transformation? I think that, you know, I've worked in this space as well, and it's not easy for people who are not necessarily technically savvy. So how do you approach that? What do you do?
I think that's a really difficult challenge, and it's one that almost everybody who's worked in the e-commerce space will face at some time. I think what we need to do is think very clearly about how much do we need to speak in, I'm going to use the word English, but you know, whichever your native language is, versus the jargon that we adopt as professionals within the e-commerce space. And remember that when you talk to a board or senior stakeholders in the business, they're generally experts, but within a narrow field. They've either been with the organization that they've worked for quite a long time, worked their way up, so they'll know the jargon and the expertise of their business, or they'll know their niche. They'll know how to be a really good finance director, or how to be a great sales director. But that doesn't mean that they've got any experience of the language we would use, you know, the sort of call to actions that you'd use on a website to get people to do things. You know, why is that button green and not red? Those kind of really basic, breaking down the technical language that we use into things that people can understand and get a hold on. But I think one of the things that's always come across to me is that you have to say it simply, say it often, and say it again. And focus very much on what are we trying to deliver rather than the technology we're going to use to deliver it. And I think this is really challenging for people that are really comfortable with jargon. And we often fall into, you know, what's my ERP today? When I go to a new organization, I'm using this ERP, I'm using this CRM system. Those acronyms often don't mean very much. And you know, I work with people, you know, from all sorts of nations and cultures, but speaking in that very plain, down-to-earth language, what is that I'm going to do that is going to make your job easier, I think really comes forward.
Simplification. I think that's a theme that we've heard from you know, a number of people. It's just really simplifying, you know, the message to get things done and really understanding what you're focusing on. That's great.
Absolutely. And particularly with boards, you know, what's the return on the investment? How do you express all the technical language we're going to come up with in a project in terms that people will understand, and ultimately what is the bottom line that we're trying to deliver?
Yep. I like the idea of just focusing on the ends and not we're going to do this custom development in this platform and all this stuff that they're probably not going to understand or appreciate, like, oh, we're going to make it headless, or these new, jargon terms for some of the new ways of things that we do in our space, but focusing on like, hey, we're going to automate 50% of orders so that your salespeople can spend 50% more of their time selling new customers instead of being on the phone taking orders.
Absolutely. I found it really powerful sometimes to break it right down to, what is the cost of processing an order? And the extreme examples are often useful to get this across. If you've got €1 million order, £1 million order, $1 million order versus a €10 or pound order, often the cost of typing that into a modern ERP, using jargon again, is exactly the same. It's a person for a few minutes typing that order in. But the profit that you gain from those two orders is vastly different. And potentially the percentage profit is much greater on the smaller value order. And you retain that profit to a much greater degree if you automate that process than you do on the $1 million order. So if I've got a spread of orders where 70, 80, 90% of those orders are relatively low value, then automating those orders first, although you won't take as much value online, you will retain profit to a much greater degree than if you focused on the big, exciting orders that the business loves to take and boast about. But ultimately, your sales force can still handle those big orders and probably will want to. You think about the psychology of being a salesperson.
And that kind of ties into the next topic, but I love that idea. And I think that's such a smart way to think about it, is like, what's the cost of taking an order? And obviously it might not be exactly the same per order, but figuring that out. And then you could probably make a business case. Hey, all orders under $50,000 or whatever number that the company feels comfortable with, let's automate that. Let's focus on all orders under this number, get that online, really make a business case to drive that all online. And then the organization's working towards something. The salespeople understand it. The processing people understand it. So you kind of have this like goal as a company, and the salespeople, they're probably still going to want to be hands-on on the $1 million orders, because, no one wants to type in the wrong key and mess up $1 million order. But
it's not just that, it's the natural human instinct.
Yeah.
This is my next paycheck.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that goes smoothly.
Yeah.
But
they don't need to be on the phone with $1,000 order every time. So, yeah, going into kind of the next topic, like, how do you envision, Salesforce integration into e-commerce? And I think we can kind of look at that holistically, like with CRM, and it might not be Salesforce. It could be Microsoft Dynamics, just generally CRM, and then also the actual Salesforce. Like, how is it kind of become unified instead of this? I think a lot of organizations, I still see it's like salespeople and then e-commerce, and they're just way too separate.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the silos that you can sometimes inadvertently create when you add an e-commerce system that is probably taking price and product data directly from your ERP without notion of what salespeople are doing in the CRM. I think that's one of the things that you need to consider in your architecture. And Salesforce is one example, as you said. But I think the key bit is, for me, we need to think about the customer experience here. If I build a relationship with you as a customer of mine, and I also have an e-commerce site, then you expect that the price and the product negotiation that we've been through in a face-to-face or telephone encounter will also be reflected on my e-commerce site. So if you step back and say, okay, let's forget about the internal competition or silos that we have and start thinking about it from the customer's point of view, what's the customer experience I want to give? I want to give that customer the same product, the same price, however that customer chooses to engage with me. Essentially an omni-channel approach rather than a multi-channel approach. And so for me, I think the crucial bit is tracking that product data and that price data through to make sure that your e-commerce site is not just linked to an ERP, but also taking any inputs that are necessary from a CRM, where a salesperson may have logged that, I'm giving this person 3% off this month.
Gotcha.
I want to close that deal.
So you think about it more as, how do you unify their experience? So, maybe 50, they order online most of the time, but one day they're on the road and they just call you up and say, hey, I want to place this order. I'm like going to a job site. I need an order of these 10 things. But later the next day, they go back and log in and order some new stuff. They want to see their orders. They want to see how much they've bought. Make sure everything should be kind of unified in terms of price, ordering through online and offline. Yeah,
that comes directly from, I suppose, what has really been 80% of all of my jobs. It's not so much, can I build a website? It's, how do I get an existing legacy B2B organization and its sales teams to want to engage with that website and not see it as a threat? So if I am a salesperson and I've dealt with this customer for 4 or 5 years, I've built up a great relationship, but suddenly the website has failed them because it's presenting the wrong product or the wrong price or something goes wrong, then why would I push my next customer or even encourage that customer to place their next orders online and not over the phone with me? I'm here to protect my commission, my sales, my customers. And so if you're an e-commerce teammate, you're wanting to make sure that that salesperson feels really comfortable and really confident. And it's very easy to say, well, just tell the sales team to do things. But the reality is, in most jobs, in most organizations, you have to win the hearts and minds as much as rely on diktat to get things done. And certainly, I think, different sales cultures in different countries do work differently, don't get me wrong. But I've always found that the biggest challenges salespeople have is where they think the website is doing something they're not in control of. That they still own the relationship with that customer. And often in B2B selling, particularly if you're not just focused on the individual commodity, it's about a contract or a longer term relationship. And that's still a people thing to a very large degree. The individual product order might not be the big thing, but how am I going to maintain that relationship? And therefore, what do I need to do with that sales team to give them the confidence that the e-commerce is a real bonus for them?
Yeah. So really making the sales team view the e-commerce as an ally, like they're all on the same team.
Playing in the same
E-commerce is,
direction, with the
yeah.
same data, the customer experience is good, whether they are looking at the website, buying from the website. Maybe they're creating a quote on the website, but they're phoning the salesperson up to say, can you do me a deal at the end of the month on the prices and the products that I've already specified? Linking that process so that you really integrate it together. I think that's a really critical step whenever you're not in a pure play scenario. If you're a business adding an e-commerce proposition to an existing sales force, you've got to take them with you, because whatever your long-term plans are, in the medium term, you've got that sales force, and that's what you want to work with.
Just a quick comment on this great topic. I mean, one of the things that I've found, and I think you would agree, is that I've gone into meetings of this sort in recent years, and I say, well, where are the salespeople in the stakeholder meeting, right? Like, where are they, right? Making sure that they're there, and then really also pointing out that you're trying to help them do their job better. So you're going out and saying, what can I do to help you? It's not like, what can I do to replace you with a robot, right? I mean, because it's almost the same concern that I've heard from people. It's like automation, is this sometimes legitimate fear, for people, but that's not the story here at all. The story is, I'm trying to add efficiency layers, let's say, or personalization layers, or other things that will allow you to do your job better.
Absolutely, and maybe it's because I started as a salesperson with my A to Z map on my car, going around to see customers. But for me, the beauty of e-commerce in a B2B environment is that if you're the sort of salesperson who essentially acts as a checkout operator does in a supermarket, sort of beep, 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 my order's going to go through, I'll type it, I'll take it over the phone and I'll type it, hopefully. That job, let's be honest, is probably, it's time limited. Yeah, because that can be automated, that can be shoved online. It can be often these days just done over an IVR system on telephone. But the majority of B2B selling that I've worked in requires expertise, requires knowledge and value add, requires a relationship to be built between the individual representing my company and the individual representing your company. And that relationship, it's going to be really hard to build an e-commerce system. I'm not saying that 10 years time we won't have a bot that'll do everything and react to people's facial gestures and things, but that's going to be really hard to do. And so I think where the good salesperson will succeed is in understanding that the relationship and those value adds are absolutely where they're going to be, but the day-to-day ordering, that's where e-commerce comes in, and it's a partnership. It's essentially the modern version of sales administration that used to exist, those desks where orders would get sent in triplicate and somebody would type that into a system. That's what e-commerce does in a big B2B context for me.
Yeah, and I like that idea of, I think a good sales rep should be going in and looking at, okay, here are my 100 customers that I manage, here's what they're buying, or, you look and you see on e-commerce, they bought these 10 things. Well, maybe they have some project coming up, give them a call, like, here, did you think about these things? Or you might be able to add a bunch of value to what they're buying online, or they might not be aware of things that you guys can do as a company. So you could use the data coming in from e-commerce to call up your customers and come
Absolutely.
up with all sorts of things.
This is the big win, I think, for salespeople. If it's made available and if it's thought through in the process, is what is that going to tell you about the customer's behavior that is going to drive you to more sales in the future? How many more customers can you handle because the e-commerce system is taking the day-to-day ordering? How much more efficient, how much more commission are you going to earn? Well, let's boil it right down. If you're hiring good salespeople, they're focused on what they're going to earn. And how much more profit can I make me, essentially, by driving this process in? And I think for sales directors, who are often the key stakeholder in that process, it's how do e-commerce people help them think about what changes about their sales team structure? How does their role change? What's their day-to-day time and diary going to look like when an e-commerce platform is taking 50, 60, 70% of their business in terms of the day-to-day ordering? What does the role change to, and how do I make that efficient? And I think that's where there's a really interesting dynamic if e-commerce people can really support sales and sales teams in that process. It's a virtuous circle for the company.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
and I do like
awesome.
that term virtuous circle, by the way. Sorry to cross over. The term virtuous circle, I've used that in some other recent conversations, and this is exactly that. It's not vicious cycle, like for some other things. This is a virtuous circle where you're doing something. It's really, for example, it's allowing you to do new things you were never able to do because it's freed up time, right? I mean, so that's also something really important. It's not just the personalization and the efficiency and what have you. Totally new things can happen as well.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So I have a segue over to something else just for a second, because you are across the pond, as people have often phrased it, and here we are in beautiful USA. Let's talk about internationalization, as a topic in B2B e-commerce, and specifically, I think our listeners are going to be interested in going beyond just currency or language. So, what sort of things should people consider? Let's just talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is my experience is predominantly European. Whilst I've got contacts and I've worked with people in Asia Pac, yeah, my experience is predominantly there. But I think the danger often, particularly with Brits and Americans, is the language is a little bit of a double-edged sword. We speak the same language, so we assume everything's the same, and it often just isn't. And the obvious things, as I say, you know, the language currency issues. You know, I had a call once at Insight where I was on the call at 10 o'clock at night. My Australian colleague was having breakfast, and the team in Los Angeles were on the call with the client at lunchtime.
Oh yeah.
And one of our American colleagues threw to the client that we could get this job done in 2 weeks. And I messaged my colleague in Australia. I said, I've got 14 countries, 7 currencies, and every one of those countries and currencies has a unique set of SKUs to deal with, and some unique prices, and local teams that need to be informed and negotiated with. How's the situation for you? And he said, well, much the same. I said, how many SKUs and prices and languages that the American team deal with? And he said, 1. And I thought to myself, well, that really sums it up. I mean, and a lot of it is just the complexity that comes from what looks like the same product being supplied into multiple markets. So, I mean, the obvious things, you know, US is on 110 volts, Europe is on 220, 240. Little things like, well, okay, that's fine, but Switzerland, which is not in the EU, as the UK now isn't, operates with a requirement for a different electrical connection, and you have to provide the right documentation with that, even though the machine that you're selling may be nominally identical. So what are the implications in terms of the product that I'm supplying and the SKU set that I'm supplying? And are there additional SKUs or additional taxation issues that I haven't perhaps thought through when I'm building something? And I suppose the chances are your audience is probably US based. And it's very easy sometimes to think, actually, I'm going to sell the same thing. But you've got different legal and taxation restrictions often that really come into play. And again, I'll give you an example from Ricoh. Ricoh is an office print manufacturer, and selling products like printers incurs different challenges in different markets, even within the European Union, which has gone a long way to standardizing these things. So in most European countries, there is a document tax that has to be added to the value of anything that involves the production of documents. That taxation varies and is not necessarily the same or even applied in the same way between European Union states, even though it's a standard taxation process. The UK don't even care about it, didn't even care when we were in the single market. So how do I present that on my website? Does my customer need to see that as a separate line item because they've got to bill for that? And you know, when I was going through this process in Ricoh, the UK site, the Swedish site, no issue, didn't even need to think about it. Germany, Switzerland, Spain, absolutely a problem. We've got to present that as a separate line. So thinking through how markets work is potentially pretty complex, and that's where it's important when you're building these global setups to think about, how do I get that local knowledge? How do I make sure I express that so that I'm presenting that forward in the right way? And you know, how am I going to ensure that the user who comes on the site sees the things that make them feel comfortable making the purchase that you're trying to sell? And you know, little example. One, very early on in my time at Insight, I asked why the Canadian website was being run from Europe. And it was as simple as the US ERP at the time, I'm sure I've changed it now, couldn't cope with the notion of a dollar that was not the same, or the requirement to produce a website in French as well as in English. And you know, if you want to do government business in Canada, you have to have French. It's just, and you know, they haven't succumbed to quite the same dollar at this point. It's these real subtleties. Sometimes it's things that people just don't think about. And the same is true in the other way. If I write something in the UK form of English, the chances are you'll look at it and think, I understand it, I can read it, but it doesn't feel like my English. There's U's and things in words like colour. And why are they there? And it's
Why are they there?
Yeah, and it builds more trust when you're like, it's in my native language.
Absolutely, and you often see it. It's very easy for organisations either side of the pond to go, well, okay, English in particular is the same, but you as a native of either side, you'll notice if it isn't, and that applies too for Spaniards. The difference between the Spanish spoken in Spain and the Spanish spoken in Latin America can be quite marked. French is not the same in different countries. Even within Europe, the Swiss, being efficient and having a good proportion of their population being German speakers, have a word for 70 in French. The French don't. They have three 20s and a 10 as their and it's these kind of things that when you're thinking about how do I express this in language really come forward, and my site is truly internationalized or not, and I think that comes through. But I think the other thing I was going to quickly say was culture and how do I buy. For example, in Germany, people prefer not to buy on credit. And if you're buying if you're running an operation, credit cards are not a big thing in Germany. In the Netherlands, the ideal system is much more popular as a payment option than tools like PayPal or the sort of standard integrations you get with banks. So understanding, again, that local knowledge can be really important.
I heard like Germany, is it Germany that does a lot of like check, or you can literally just check out and then pay when you get it, or you send them a check?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of B2B business tends to be on account, but certainly they are much as a culture, and it dates back to that. If you look at the whole sort of history of post-war Germany and their mania for savings, it comes really from the tragedies in the 20s and 30s of hyperinflation, people literally shifting wheelbarrows of cash. And that cultural background means that Germans tend to save for purchases. They tend not to want to have credit cards. They'll go and they'll save up to buy their new Mercedes. Whereas the UK and I'm assuming the US are much more, well, okay.
US is very credit card. Yeah. So it sounds like, to sum this all up, to your point, it's not like they said, oh, let's get this all done in 2 weeks. It's pretty complicated when you're trying to expand to all these regions, and then you have a lot of different stores to manage in terms of nuances between the different experiences, and it just becomes this magnitude of complexity.
There is an additional complexity. I think the other thing that I would say is the way that users prefer to work, the level of approvals that may be necessary in some countries to get orders approved will often be different. So if you're all, working in organizations where essentially the director of the organization has to approve spend, that can be much more formal in some countries and some contexts than it is particularly in the UK. Is fairly straightforward, but people can often require written approvals to be able to be the person that says, I am going to sign this off. So it's just, I think that the point I think is worth making, probably because I am from across the pond, is just it's not always as straightforward as saying, well, we're just going to go sell there. You're going to need some local knowledge, and you're going to need to think through each of those markets.
Awesome.
I mean, one thing I would just underline also is that I in some of the conversations I've had recently, when people are talking about internationalization, it really is like a category of personalization, right? I mean, because, our abilities to get more one-on-one in B2B and B2C e-commerce, have changed in recent years. And now, why leave out internationalization or just say country, and it's really something much more, as you're saying, the people and the culture and all of these layers. Because of course, here Isaiah and I are in the US, and people will talk about regional differences, in the US when you're targeting certain types of approaches or what have you. But, there are regional differences in every place on earth, and those things need to be recognized if you're really going to build out your B2B e-commerce operation.
Absolutely. And I think the two other things that are sort of associated with that, firstly, that country and language are not necessarily synonymous. I've seen a need for English as a language in most European countries, because certainly where you have international clients, they'll often have expats or native speakers to native standard of English who maybe not from that country, and they'll be much more comfortable in a business context using English. But I think, Switzerland, for example, is a great example. You want one country, but you're going to have at least 3 business languages and probably 4.
Wow.
In French, German, Italian, English, potentially Romansh, but predominantly those 4.
If people know, I mean, isn't it something like 50,000 people speak Romansh now? It's that Isaiah, you may know this.
I guess it would depend on how
Latin derivative. It's like this Latin remainder.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It's how many customers. Most would be able to speak perfectly fluent Swiss German or French, Swiss French.
And I think this is, to your point, where you have to make these business cases, because all of a sudden it's like you said, it's easy to say, oh, we're going to expand all these countries, but the amount of complexity and time and effort that you might be putting into all these regions, and then you're getting 2 orders from this region and 3 orders,
absolutely. You need to think very clearly on, is it worth the time, effort, and money spinning up your site in a particular country? For example, you look at the Nordics, a significant proportion of the spend in the Nordics is Sweden. The others are relatively small players in a lot of this, but you may have an individual client that you need to service. So do you have your site able to cope with Norwegian orders occasionally from this one client that's based there? And do you need Norwegian, or would English do? And it'll depend on your client base. If they're international, 9 times out of 10 it'll be English that'll be fine.
So you just have like and I've seen some companies do this where they just have regions, like not necessarily countries, like, hey, if you're in this region, it's English or whatever they decide.
I guess it depends how well established you are. I mean, certainly in the north of Europe and the smaller countries, the Netherlands generally, Nordics, they tend to be fine with English. If you certainly wouldn't, you'd fail miserably if you tried that in France. And you probably have a hard time in Germany. The bigger the country, the more likely it is they want you to speak their language and be,
Yep. Makes a lot of sense.
It's one of those things you need to think through clearly if you're thinking about your strategy. You're probably, if it's first time into the European market, you're probably thinking, well, Germany's the biggest country, UK, France, Italy. Okay, once I've got those 4, where do I go next and how? And those are the things you need to think through, I think.
So I'm going to ball up my remaining questions into, a moment, and you can kind of tackle it, and then we can segue over to Isaiah to ask, a few more things. So here's a couple things to kind of capture here. So success and failure, right? I mean, I think we are talking a lot about this as, a through line, going with all of these things that we've discussed, like what allows for success, or, what can cause failure, those kinds of things. So that's important. And I want to make sure we get maybe a specific tip or two, but also that's also tied in for me with maybe ideas that you've seen in B2C that haven't yet, moved over into B2B. So, just how would you, address those 2 areas that our listeners, usually look forward to?
Well, I think I think the point about success and failure, I mean, is really about understanding two things: your market and your product that you're ultimately trying to use e-commerce for. So I think if you are an organization that relies at some level on volume orders, whether that is I've negotiated a contract with you and for the next 3 years all of the XYZ machines will be delivered, or whether that is I'm a widget distributor and here's a million different types of widgets for you to come and visit and buy. I think that's where e-commerce really comes into play. The challenge, and I think really this came across from B2C, but the challenge that B2B offers is around personalization. And the most common personalization in B2B is price. I think we often in B2B take ourselves as secondary to B2C. We talk about the wonderful B2C personalization for the user, but actually most B2B e-commerce people have been doing this for decades, but they've been doing it in terms of customer price that's been negotiated. And that level of personalization is often the reason our sites tend to be a little bit slower than the site that you might get to buy your clothes or your shoes. You know, we're having to serve you up your personalized price on a range of product that might be 50, 60,000 SKUs deep, with potentially different margins in different product categories. And we're having to serve that up to you as you log in, as we find out who you are as an individual. That's a pretty epic piece of personalization that B2C doesn't even have to consider 90 times out of 100. So I think, don't get me wrong, I think we can learn from B2C, and we have done. I think if you look at the typical B2B e-commerce environment now, it's mobile enabled, it's responsive, it's available in formats that you would see in a B2C environment. The challenge is what's coming next from B2C, and how do we adapt that to an experience that reflects the essential contractual relationship between one company and another? Because I think that obligation is slightly different. And for me, the businesses that succeed in doing this are ones that listen to their customers and listen to their sales forces. And I know that sounds really simplistic, but those are the two things that for me work in a B2B environment.
Gotcha. No, that was a great answer. So really, like, making sure your site actually is supporting the team and the salespeople, and it's not just this siloed thing that.
Unless you're envisaging that you are going to go to a pure play e-commerce operation and essentially getting rid of your sales force, and there are, in my belief, is that very few B2B organizations will want to do that, because most B2B organizations that I've worked with and I've seen are, even if they supply a commodity product, you know, I am widget manufacturer extraordinaire from Würzburg in Germany, it's the best widget you'll ever find, the chances are that your sales team is talking about the value add of using this widget, of the engineers that support this widget, of the extensive knowledge and the applications that we can, and all the add-on pieces. Unless you're going to be that sort of organization that says, okay, I'm just going to sell whatever I get in from a product feed somewhere, then I think you've got to win hearts and minds in your sales team and keep them front of center. You have stakeholders in your customers and you have stakeholders in your e-commerce sales team.
Makes so much sense. So what do you think, we talked about price as being one of the big differentiators and how complex price is with B2B versus B2C, where it's just one price, you know, per SKU, and it's pretty straightforward. Besides price, which we've talked a lot about, like, what are some of the key features or differences that you're seeing from e-commerce than B2C, where you're not seeing a lot of B2B with Shopify because it's more of a B2C platform?
Yeah, and I think the platforms are starting to realize those differences. So, increasingly you'll find that some level of approval management system is built in, some level of integration to punch out and round trip. or an easy connector to a service like Punch Out to Go. Those things are required from volume B2B customers. I think the ability to restrict users and restrict the catalog that you're seeing, that's one of the major differences for me between why Amazon Business isn't yet a medium and large company player to a large extent compared to the likes of a Revered or Cooper. If I've got 60,000 SKUs, but I only want my ordinary people, day-to-day users to order 10 of them, I need to be able to lock that system down. So I had a client at Insight who wanted every user to be able to order a select group of 30 products, but wanted their IT team to be able to order from 60,000 products. And setting up a dual punch-out system based on user recognition to be able to enable that. Those kind of facilities, I think, essentially replicate the process of a salesperson and a call center in an e-commerce environment. And those are the things I think that are going to be the biggest differences and are going to maintain that, because the difference between myself or my wife going out and shopping online, it's much less complicated. I'm much more concerned about the individual product price and the delivery and when am I going to get it versus the levels of service that I might need from a B2B environment.
Yeah, it's funny. Our one of the last guests we had, unfortunately, it's not released yet. It'll come out once we release it. The internet wasn't. I hope the internet didn't ruin it, because it was a little bit. The connection wasn't as good because I was traveling and he was in South America. So they had developed this pretty amazing, fully automated B2B experience in South America. And one of the things that he was mentioning that they've spent a lot of time thinking about is that with B2C, you're going and buying 5 shoes or 2, 3, 1, 5 items. With B2B, he's like, we have customers that might spend 5 hours or the entire day building a robust cart on the website of hundreds of products. And that experience is much different than B2C. And that kind of, to your point, that personalized catalog experience and how they're buying could be very different for customers.
Favorites lists, quick orders, I repeat my SKUs. We've even thought very seriously about subscription products for commodities, which I suppose is taking from B2C. I know particularly on Amazon now you can order some of your groceries and have those delivered every month or every 3 months or whatever. But when you consider that, well, how about a pallet of paper for a primary school every term? Those kind of fundamentals, you're going to need 40 boxes of A4 paper, and it's got to be delivered at the start of the school term so they can use it over that period of time, and then the next one doesn't need to come till the start of the next term. Those are the sorts of things. Well, how can I make it easier for the business user to order, but also how can I retain their business? How do I entangle their day-to-day job with my website in a way that makes it an experience that's not necessarily pleasurable? It's not like sitting in front of Netflix, but it's an experience that doesn't make that user feel I don't want to use that company. Well, I'm not going to give that procurement team a bad rep about this particular supplier.
One thing I'll interject too, just for a moment, is that it's really fascinating to me how long some things have taken to happen, how quickly other things have taken. Because for example, and Isaiah knows some of this, I've had a crazy career. I've done a lot of different things. I was a personal shopper at Bloomingdale's decades ago. I was a sales guy doing that, but my job as a personal shopper was to work with the big ticket clients and corporate clients. So it was individuals who are often like celebrities or whatever, and then it was corporate clients. And it was managing all of these books and paperwork and yellow forms. And we had a register that was just for the personal shoppers, and they would be typing all day, getting things set up for all these delivery. It was just like this mountain of work, right? So, time passes, And in more recent years, in the last, I'll say 5, 6 years ago, something like that, I was the head of e-commerce for a B2B and B2C company selling LED lighting, right? But they were in that transition about sales teams, on the B2B side and consumers on the B2C side, and how all of this was connecting. But on B2B, what they still had is there were humans sitting at computers in their access to that version of the e-commerce site, typing 8 hours a day the orders that would be coming in from the salespeople. So it's like, decades past, right? We go from that stage to this, and now all of a sudden, boom, in the last couple of years, it's an astounding change, where all of this can be automated and people can be freed up to, really personalize the service and help these customers, with everything they need.
I think you're absolutely right. The steps forward have been phenomenal, particularly the last few years. But I think if you're considering building an e-commerce site, whether it's B2B or B2C, you don't go far wrong if you think about what is the user, the persona of that user that you're going to be building for. And it might be, I'm going to sit there at 8 o'clock at night and I'm going to watch something on Netflix and I've got my second screen and I've got to do something. Whether it's I'm shopping for me as an individual or I'm shopping for my business. If I'm shopping for my business, how do I make it a good experience so I can still follow the plot line that I'm watching on the telly, and I can do the job that I need to do. And that's the same whether you are looking for shoes or looking for large quantities of commodities. What's that experience going to be? And then, what is my job role? Am I the decision maker, or am I simply getting a list of things that I've got to procure because I'm in a procurement operation? And how mechanical is that? If it's in a list of things, can I make it easier for that user? Can I provide a service that allows them to upload a list of SKUs and just instantly order them all? Some of the most basic looking B2B e-commerce sites do really well because all they do is they have a web form that essentially allows the user to select a bunch of SKU data, drop it in, and away you go. And those kinds of applications don't really exist in B2C, but if you think about how does that make that user's life easier? Okay, it's a 30-second job. Copy, paste from my Excel document into my website, bosh, done. and that making that life easier for that user, whether it's the junior procurement person who's given an admin task, or whether it's a manager who's got to approve 50 different requests from people across a team, I think those are the bits that really start to make a difference. And it's exactly the same skill set as if I'm trying to make sure that I'm presenting the right experience to someone in their personal life.
Mm-hmm. So now that we've talked about a lot of different topics, what do you see? And we talked about how the last 3 years have really improved a lot. What do you see in the coming, 5-10 years as kind of this next wave of evolution? And like you said, it's going to be pretty hard for someone to build a robot that gets your facial expression and is like a human salesperson or a robot salesperson. So we don't think that's going away, but
I think the really interesting thing for me is just how many business-to-business organizations haven't even started this journey.
That's why we're on the podcast, right? Just to help people do something.
So I think there's two things. Firstly, the biggest challenge I think for B2B e-commerce is actually broader than the e-commerce structure itself. It's how will those organizations and companies cope with a world that is changing increasingly quickly, where things like COVID mean that we don't work in the same way that we did. We maybe use offices much less. We're not in the same kind of environment. How do you as a selling organization support your buyers' needs when their work patterns are changing? And can we do that effectively? How do we deliver our product? Did my product require an engineer to install it? Is it going to be safe for that engineer to install it? And if not, how do I do that now? So I think if you've not started this journey, you need to think about it pretty damn quickly. and if you are on that journey, you've got to zero really, really clearly on what your changing customer needs are and how is that job persona changing. And I think that's going to be the challenge. Is not so much the technology. There'll be wonderful technology that comes forward that we can't necessarily predict over the next few years. But how do you keep zeroed in on what are my customer needs and how am I handling that? How am I reacting to that? How am I justifying to my board that I need to iterate my website again for the latest piece of technology, for the latest change in user behavior? Because those are the changes and the challenges I think most B2B organizations will actually face. Much so as from a technology point of view, you like to think, well, okay, it's the next singing or dancing piece of tech that'll come along that'll change it. I think it's actually
Gotcha.
much
I
more.
like that answer because most people, including myself, will say, it's headless e-commerce, or which we're big on, this, React or kind of disjointed front end from the back end and creating this unified user experience. But like to your point, there's the technology and that's going to evolve and that's going to get better, as we all know. But it's really this cultural shift that's going to happen in these organizations and I think COVID-19 is a big accelerator of that, where companies, and we're getting more of that too, where they're realizing we can't rely on the sales rep, flying out and, showing up at their door. Like we have to create a more unified digital experience. And that's a cultural shift that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take
Absolutely.
time.
Yeah. And what I would add too is that it's really, it's kind of like it used to be more like innovation in a way was isolated in these teams in the same way a lot of other things were siloed over the years. But now it's like the recognition that innovation's ongoing and it's everyone's responsibility, and there's got to be a process in place. And when you launch a site, you've got to know that you're making changes, and it's going to have a life, and there are other things that are going to need to happen. It's no longer like early, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, but earlier in these waves of e-commerce, craziness, people would sit down and say, well, this is my 5-year plan and I'm just done now, right? And
I built this website, that's all we'll need.
Yeah, and you can't, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's really easy for techies, people that like technology, to fall into the trap of thinking technology is the thing. For me, technology has always been about 20% of the job. The other 80% is people and culture, whether that's your customers or your existing business. It's how do you best keep them on side and catered for with the technology that you use, and placing them front of center rather than necessarily being technology led is my one, I suppose, nugget I would pass on.
Yeah, and to sum that all up, what I like about e-commerce and B2B e-commerce, and I think hopefully what gets people excited is, a lot of the B2B companies, they had, like you said, innovation. I think that was a really good point. It was IT. Like when we talk to all these B2B companies, there's the IT guy, the IT director, maybe they have a couple engineers, but there's like this siloed IT department. And I think what e-commerce can do, and people in e-commerce roles, and hopefully more B2B e-commerce or B2B organizations hire an actual e-commerce person. Because I would bet you that still the average B2B organization still doesn't have a dedicated e-commerce role person, and that person kind of bridge all, like they're kind of the bridge to everything, right? Sales, marketing, IT, operations.
And I think the fascinating thing is, depending on which consultancy the business has got involved, that e-commerce person that they finally gets hired will either be in marketing or in sales or in IT.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is you need a little bit of each of those skill sets and knowledge
Exactly.
to be able to be successful in the role.
Yeah. I like to say e-commerce is kind of your business. It is like the way that we look at it, it's your business. So it's sales, marketing, operations, and IT.
Well, it's just it's what we said before too in other episodes. E-commerce is commerce, right? I mean, that's really what it is now. I mean, it's just like that little letter at the beginning doesn't really need to be there anymore. It is commerce.
That's such a good point. We were actually working on kind of like refining our mission statement and vision. We do that every so often to kind of, things change so much. And we were just joking around with ideas, and we call it automating commerce. Like that's really what it is, right? We're joking about coining the term autocom. It sounds like a transformer or something.
Sounds like, yeah, it's very robotic. I like that.
Well, I think it's a good time to wrap up. Mark, do you have any kind of last remarks before we let you go, or how can people find you?
No.
I mean,
people can find us at our website, which is transformthedigital.com. We work all across, essentially across the globe. We've got contacts in Singapore as well as the States and Europe, and we're essentially focusing on that piece about how do we make this easier for businesses that have sold maybe the same products for years, but how do we make life easier for them to come online? We're not techies in the sense of we won't build websites, and we're not going to do you out of a job, Isaac.
There's plenty of room for competition.
What we do is help organizations shape themselves for the digital future. And that's, I think, it's an area a lot of people, a lot of agencies aren't necessarily working in. But it's in my view, it's the bigger challenge than putting up a good website.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much for kind of clarifying that. And I think if you're expanding internationally in B2B e-commerce, you got to talk to Mark. He's been there and he's dealt with all the European countries. So I hope that some of our listeners reach out to you and try and expand and learn from you. And we got a really exciting episode coming up, episode 14 with Justin Finnegan, former owner of Guerrilla Group, a pretty massive e-commerce agency. So stay tuned, and thank you so much, Mark, for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's been great.
Good talking with you guys.